On February 6th, the first part of Square Enix's showcase for 6.0, now officially titled Endwalker, came out to a great deal of fanfare from both the MMO and Mobile Suit Gundam communities. Chemist will officially remain a crafting class, and Alphino will officially be fighting for the Federation against the Principality of Zeon, along with everyone who fantasies into a Viera once Sage drops. This has understandably left a lot of people in utter shambles, especially anyone dumb enough to make a predictions video prior to an announcement showcase. Speaking of, let's take a scorecard of my predictions from the week before the announcement. While 3 of the 6 predictions I made are yet to be officially determined, the presentation did confirm that while no, Chemist isn't a thing, no, Sage looks baller anyway, we are confirmed to be going to Garlemald, and Astinian will be joining us in Trusts as a melee DPS. We'll probably get more info as to those other predictions in May of this year, which means these videos have plenty of time to accrue more views before I am proven wrong and look like a dummy in front of everyone. A quick reminder of the disclaimer from last video. While the previous 6 predictions were, in my opinion, well-founded and fairly likely to come true, this video will be focusing on far longer shots. I was gunning for about a 2/3 success rate last time, and we're going to call it a wild success if I can nail even 2 of the following 7 calls here. Without any further preamble, let's get to the Constitution. Let's set the tone of this video with a bold statement. I strongly believe that the biggest revelation upon our foray to the moon will be that Zodiark is anything but the villain he's been portrayed as for much of FF14's storyline. Here's a brief summary of what we actually do know about Zodiark. He is a primal summoned by the Convocation to save the planet during the final days, at the cost of the lives of half of the ancients, given willingly. After the first calamity was averted, the planet was so scoured by it that the population was culled by half again to give Zodiark the ether required to restore its capacity to host life. During the process, the Convocation, sans the Azim, who disagreed with their methods and was almost certainly trying to solve the root cause of the calamity, was suffused by Zodiark's darkness aspected ether in a process we've known since ARR is tempering. Elidibus, the youngest member of the Convocation, was chosen as the heart of Zodiark on account of his purity of spirit and single-minded belief in doing what was right. We know that Zodiark was successful in restoring the planet to habitability, and in the time that this took, new life sprung up. The Convocation had planned to use this new life as a catalyst to restore those who had willingly given up their own lives to Zodiark. But this process was thwarted by Venat and her group summoning Hydaelyn, who defeated Zodiark and sundered the world into 14 shards, the Source and its 13 reflections. Hydaelyn has been worshipped as the Mother Crystal for an indeterminate amount of time, and just like Zodiark, is fully capable of tempering mortal souls. We see this process carried out during A Realm Reborn, and it is through the power of Midgard Zomer that our tempering as the Warrior of Light is undone in the lead-up to Heaven's Word. After the Sundering, Elidibus, now also a primal, ceased to be the heart of Zodiark and took up the mantle of the Warrior of Light as a sympathetic force to the inhabitants of the Sundered Shards. He contacts us towards the end of A Realm Reborn as well, clearly intending to use us as another unwitting tool. This does not go exactly as he hoped it would. I want to point out a few choice bits of information here. First, Zodiark himself has done absolutely nothing to indicate that he is actually evil. The Ascians may have acted as proxies for an agenda, but aside from rejoining the shards to the Source, they've all showcased an extraordinary amount of free will and initiative for individuals who are supposedly tempered. We've seen Gaia, Fandaniel, and even Emmett Selk act in manners that are totally contradictory for someone who is traditionally tempered. And while I think there's grounds to explain this as Elder Primals just built different, I'd like to submit the Yoshitaka Amano artwork that was presented along with the Endwalker announcement. Aside from being a beautiful piece of art, this picture is, in my opinion, the smoking gun for my deduction here. I want you to look very carefully at Hydaelyn's expression in this picture. Her eyes are locked onto the planet itself, brow furrowed as if almost in disdain or frustration that Zodiark still has the world within his grasp. Below, Zodiark reaches from the void, a hellish miasma leaking from his maw as he struggles with the Mother Crystal. However, as mentioned in the presentation itself by Yoshi P, this piece was meant to be looked at from more than one perspective. I want you to pay attention to Zodiark's expression here. His eyes are wide with terror or perhaps desperation, and he's looking at the viewer of the artwork itself. His grasping hand is instead a wordless cry for help, as he fights for every breath against Hydaelyn's control of the world. I think one of the final secrets that we're going to learn in this expansion pertains to the fact that Zodiark seeks the rejoining of the world, not for the sake of his power, but for the sake of the world itself. If he was created as the ultimate salvation for the star, why would he choose to work against that interest all these years later? Question, meet, answer. We learned in the main story quest of Heavensward that primals function in a number of somewhat curious ways. They aren't technically alive. They aren't even a true version of the thing being summoned if it had existed beforehand, see Bahamut and Shiva being living individuals at one point before becoming primals, and are instead more accurately described as an idea or belief given form and will. Shadowbringers gave us some fantastic follow-up to that, with the bits of information drip-fed to us in Amarant. Creation magic was the purview of the ancients, who through sheer magical might gave physical form to ideas, notions, and concepts by the manipulation of ether into matter. This is the same process by which primals are created, and also by which gear is crafted by Disciple of the Hand classes, which is wild, albeit in a far cruder and more primitive form. We also know that primals exist with a function in mind when they are created, which is extremely determinate on how they think and in which ways they will use their tempered followers. Bahamut was formed from the hateful wishes of dragonkind and existed only for the sake of destruction. Ramu, on the other hand, is a hermit king of the sylphs, serving as a territorial protector of the Deep Twelve's wood and his flock. And likewise, it stands to reason that Hydaelyn serves her originally created purpose, to stop Zodiark and protect the lives that have sprung forth since the world was nearly ended all those years ago. However, this bodes a very serious problem. The world was not meant to exist as 14 separate shards, and this may be the secret at the heart of the 6.0 conflict. The Ascians have spoken at length about redressing the imbalance, and we have now prevented another umbral calamity and the next rejoining. Emmett Selk's voiceover at the beginning of the Endwalker trailer says, and I quote, "I think what we're seeing in Endwalker is not simply Fandaniel instigating a calamity, but the natural consequence of the Sundering, possibly accelerated. We have very little information about Vanat and her group of Amarosians who summoned Hydaelyn, but if she was created in haste or without proper foresight, her very programming as a primal could be the cause of this entire mess. If she was created exclusively to oppose Zodiark, and Zodiark is the only way to redress the imbalance, well, we'd have the kind of catch-22 that would require some outside assistance and maybe a timely trip to the moon." During the 6.0 presentation, the next raid tier was confirmed as Pandemonium, and accompanied by a highly suspicious picture of an Ascian, with one half of a very familiar mask pattern. As the number of people deduced within hours, we've gotten another mugshot of La Habrea, a realm reborn in Heavensward antagonist and unsundered Ascian jobber extraordinaire. As with a lot of elements of Final Fantasy XIV, there's a ton of storytelling meta from previous games in the franchise at play here, and signs are pointing to this game's Pandemonium being very similar to the Final Fantasy II dungeon of the same name. After the death of Emperor Mateus, the headlining big bad of the aforementioned title, and talented David Bowie impersonator, at the hands of Firion and his friends, his soul is split in two, and one half of it is cast into the bowels of hell. Through his revived power as the new Emperor of Hell, Mateus raises Satan's castle, Pandemonium, from the bowels of the earth where it had been sealed. Firion and co. manage to fight through it, beat up the now even bigger bad, and roll the credits. This is glossing over a few details, of course, but I think you get the general picture. Final Fantasy II was a bit of an odd duck, all things considered. Circling back to Final Fantasy XIV, there are a couple of salient points I'd like to leverage for my conclusion. First, this game's lore is absolutely steeped in Final Fantasy XII parallels, and one of the biggest when it comes to the current storyline is that each member of the Convocation is named as a Scion of Light in that game. Each of those Scions of Light has a corresponding Scion of Darkness, which are featured as the summons in the world of Ivalice. Speaking of, we fight a number of them in the Stormblood Alliance raid series, which is a jumbled mixture of lore from Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy XII. They're a mix of the Zodiac Braves from the former game and the Espers from the latter, but I want to point out that La Habrea, quote, the Abyssal Celebrant, is directly opposed by Mateus the Corrupt. This should seal the deal on La Habrea being the key figure of this raid series, and with what we explicitly know at this point, I think there are grounds for the raid tier to take a variety of approaches to what kind of bosses we'll be fighting. However, in the famous words of Billy Mays, but wait, there's more! It's time for common sense to enter the picture. The Eden raid tier served as a thematic celebration in parallel of many older fights from A Realm Reborn. We got retooled battles with all the primals from the original expansion, along with a number of thematic nods, and one major fight from the World of Darkness Alliance raid. Prior to that, the Omega raid tier was one big homage to super bosses and highlights from previous Final Fantasy titles, but had only one fight that was really original, in this case 012. In Heaven's Word, we battled through the Colossus Alexander and all of the wackadoodle goblin technology contained therein, and in A Realm Reborn, we fought through the Coils to learn the mystery of the Elder Primal that almost destroyed the world at the end of 1.0. This leaves a surprisingly narrow niche for Endwalker's raid series. Building on multiple series callbacks without serious context a la Omega is out, Eden has the lots of primals angle covered, and we've quite frankly run out of headlining summons to battle in the same fashion as Alexander or Bahamut. I think there's grounds to consider Pandemonium as being a menagerie of experiments from the greatest master of creation magics the world has ever seen. But I believe the far more interesting story of battling the true forms of each member of the Convocation will be what we see, given the story beats that have tied up Shadowbringers. Despite doing battle with 5 members of the Convocation directly, Nabriales, Igeor, La Habrea, Emet-Selch, and Elidibus, we've only battled one of them at the peak of their power, Hades, the true name and form of Emet-Selch, as we fight him in the Dying Gasp. This leaves 12 remaining members of the Convocation as potential fights, and given the level of escalation in terms of the foes we've fought over the course of Shadowbringers, it seems like the next logical step for challenging the Warrior of Light in Universe. I'd like to make a further prediction here. The raid series will not end with La Habrea, but will instead culminate with us squaring off against a manifestation of the Azim at the height of their power. Anyone who's played Final Fantasy IV is probably well aware that the Endwalker reveals are pointing towards 6.0, borrowing a lot from the broad strokes of that game's plot, and it seems likely that Thavnair will play host to another one, namely, where we'll be finding our ride to the moon. The 5.4 MSQ took great pains to make it obvious to the player that G'raha Tia was capable of interacting with ancient Allagan technology, and while I initially expected us to grab a remodeled craft from the Garleans, it's looking more and more like we'll be visiting Garlemald towards the end of the expansion after we've had some time on the moon. If that's the case, we'll likely see some meaty parallels to the raising of the lunar whale in Final Fantasy IV. The ship rested on the bottom of the sea near Mysidia, the land of the mages, and a coordinated effort from them was required to surface the vessel and put the player on their way to the moon. Thavnair would provide ample opportunity for such a scene, and could also serve as the host area for a much-anticipated primal fight. The released concept art for Thavnair paints it brilliantly with Indian and Southeast Asian iconography. There's been some speculation that the Matanga Beast tribe might be the ones summoning Anima, the only confirmed primal we've seen so far. But it's far more likely, given the furious persecution of, and bloodlust for, the Ora by the tempered members of their race, that the culprit here is Ashura, who originally served as Queen of the Eidolons in Final Fantasy IV. Considering the aesthetic of Matanga as Indian elephant people, their primal being derived from real-world Hindu mythology makes a whole lot of sense, and it's quite frankly surprising we haven't seen her already. In fact, I strongly suspect that Ashura was originally intended to be featured in the Boja questline as the form that Gunhildr took, but was likely repurposed into a headlining fight in Endwalker for the sake of visibility at some point during development. Once again, Final Fantasy IV has a precedent that I believe we'll see play out here in Endwalker. The Lunarians have remained inside the Lunar Palace on the moon for hundreds of years in suspended animation, overseen by an ancient sage named Fuso-Ya. Cecil and his allies venture to the moon and become allies with this ancient master of magics, who aids them toward the last leg of their quest as a temporary party member. Dovetailing back to the topic of Allagan spaceships, I'm going to stake my claim here. There are going to be living Allagans on the moon. This is a spacefaring civilization who is capable of technological feats that rival those of ancient magic, and it's extremely surprising they somehow disappeared entirely off the face of Eorzea, when they ought to have been able to harness their vast knowledge even after the series of earthquakes that buried their civilization to rebuild elsewhere. Despite the ostensibly Charlian aesthetic of the Sage Job teaser, a closer inspection of the equipment used during the teaser shows as being virtually identical to the Ironworks gear sold by Rowena's vendors. All of those items are repurposed and originally of Allegan make, which lends credence to the notion that we're getting potentially bamboozled by the trailer itself, and that Alphino, Boy Wonder, will be getting his job change courtesy of an extraterrestrial once we make it to the moon. Endwalker has been confirmed as the finale of the current story arc that we've been building up to since 2.0 and the launch of A Realm Reborn. And if there's going to be an expansion to fit one, or maybe even more extra trials in, it's this one. Shadowbringers has received universal acclaim for its main scenario quests and single-player content, but it has received some deserved criticism for its relative lack of post-launch content and, in places, questionable allocation of development resources. If the story of 6.0 will take place across less new territory, as it currently seems, time and manpower can be allocated in other ways, and putting some real oomph into the final series of encounters would be a fantastic way to really send home the story. We have a slew of antagonists lined up and ready to deal with between Fandaniel and his lunar Bahamut, Xenos, and a couple of Elder Primals who need their business sorted out, and that's without going into Anima and the aforementioned likelihood that we'll be seeing Ashura. Nothing says end of a Final Fantasy story like a slew of major bosses after all. Yoshi P has stated that Endwalker won't be the end of Final Fantasy XIV, and that a new story will begin after the conclusion of the expansion's main plot at launch. But it will certainly be the end of an era. I can't wait to see what direction the story takes from here on out, and I hope you have just as much fun as I do when we finally get to see it.